All right, so we're ready to start. Welcome everyone to the first ACJ Public Education pseudo live podcast. We have been blessed with Professor Matthew Berkman joining us today, who's a political scientist specializing in American Jewish history, race and ethnicity, and the Israel-Palestine conflict. He received a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 2018, and he is currently working on a book project about evolving American Jewish definitions of anti-Semitism. His work has been published in Jewish Social Studies, the Journal of Modern Jewish Studies, and American Jewish History. And he's also done some pretty extensive research and writing on the ACJ itself. So, Professor Berkman or Matt, thank you so much for being with us here today. Um, and we're going to start.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, what got you interested in studying the council in the first place? It's kind of an obscure topic.
Yeah, so I was writing a dissertation about American Jewish politics that attempted to kind of explain a shift that took place that a lot of historians of American Jewish life talk about. It's this shift towards a kind of a single shared political agenda. It's usually referred to in terms of Israel as like the pro-Israel consensus that comes about, especially after the 1967 war, the Six-Day War. And so I'm looking at the kind of genesis of this moment where all the major American Jewish organizations, of course, except for the council and maybe a few much smaller organizations, kind of converge around support for Israel and Zionism. And also I'm looking at the kind of parallel shift that happens in the same period towards the centralization of authority in the American Jewish institutional universe. And so, kind of to explain why a certain prior decentralization and diversity of viewpoint had disappeared from the American Jewish world, I had to look a bit closer at the organizations that had opposed the centralizing tendency and the unifying tendency, and to figure out what became of those organizations. Why didn't they succeed? Were they, assassinated, or did they die of natural causes, or what happened? And so that brought me to the council, which kind of like fit the exact profile of the type of group that I was trying to study. So at a time when Zionism is becoming increasingly important to major American Jewish organizations and Jewish life in America more generally, the council emerges in 1942 as an organization that is seeking to continue this earlier tradition of Reform Jewish anti-Zionism that had once been kind of predominant among, let's say, the American Jewish institutional leadership or the elite of the American Jewish community. But that now, in 1942, in the wake of the rise of Nazism and the revelations about the Holocaust, and eventually, later the creation of Israel, this kind of old paradigm is going out of fashion. And so, I'm looking at why this transition took place in the council. Also, in addition to the Zionist piece, it also opposed and was kind of very vocal about its opposition to the idea that a single organization or a single ideological tendency could speak in the name of American Jews writ large, which is exactly something that all the other major groups were like working at the time to achieve. And it did this, exactly at this moment when the other major groups were coming together in this formal coordinating structure, this organizational structure that was intended to create this semblance of unity on the American Jewish landscape. And this structure is called the National Community Relations Advisory Council. And it's NCRAC is the acronym, and it's usually said NACRAC. So if I say NACRAC, I'm referring to this entity, and it's is the kind of the main topic of my dissertation, and it's kind of the umbrella body for all of the local Jewish community councils that are created by the Jewish philanthropic federations in all the different cities where there are Jewish communities, and they come together with the major national organizations, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Congress, and others, to like coordinate their activities and speak in a unified voice. And so, yeah, I'm looking at this organization. And so at the time when I was writing the dissertation, I was most concerned with kind of like the conflict between the American Council for Judaism and NACRAC, and it's specifically kind of we'll kind of suss out the effects of NACRAC's ultimate decision to kind of denounce the council and kind of excommunicate it in 1950, kind of like effects of that on the ability of the council to reproduce itself. But kind of in the course of my archival research on the council, I came to the conclusion that the near terminal decline of the council that began in, of the original council, obviously you've rebooted it, so it wasn't a terminal decline, but it was a near terminal decline that began in like the late 1960s. It was not only a matter of kind of like external sanctioning by this new centralized organization that I was studying, but it was also kind of a matter of incongruity or incompatibility or maladaptation between the worldviews of council leaders and members on the one hand, and the kind of changing cultural environment of the post-war United States on the other hand. And so that, kind of became the focus of another article that I wrote, kind of expanding on things that I looked at in my dissertation. And so that's how I first got to it.
So you mentioned that there was just some kind of ideological mismatch, not just within the Jewish world with the council, but with like where America writ large had ended up politically by the late 60s. Um, what was that mismatch? Like what was the council trying to hold on to? What had shifted? Were there and in particular, I think there was probably like a core set of values that were in conflict. And what would you say those values were?
Yeah. Um, so yeah, you got to go back to kind of like, how was the council founded? What was the like initiating event? And so I mean, there's people I know on this chat who are like, high level, longtime members of the council. So this won't be news to you, but maybe other people out there, it is new to them. So, like the council started as an initiative of dissenting rabbis within the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the Reform Movement's rabbinical organization. Are you a member of that, Andy? Okay,
I
so
am.
there you go. So it's your organization, and these rabbis were reacting to this particular resolution that was passed in 1942, called like the Jewish Army Resolution, that called for the creation of a Jewish military force in Palestine to fight alongside the Allies in World War II. So that was kind of like the last straw for this group of rabbis, but they were really reacting to the kind of a broader Zionist turn in Reform Judaism that had been occurring since at least the 1930s, if not earlier, which, these dissenting rabbis viewed this turn as a lamentable retreat from the anti-Zionist worldview or anti-nationalist worldview laid out in the Reform Movement's 1885 Pittsburgh platform, with which, many students of American Judaism are familiar. The Pittsburgh platform, one of the many things that it declared in establishing kind of like the ideological foundation for Reform Judaism in America is that Jews are no longer a nation, and we disclaim any, return to Palestine, and there's no like personal Messiah. And it did a lot of other things, and I may mention one or two of those, but that is kind of the in terms of Zionism, the essence of the Pittsburgh platform. So these rabbis were dismayed by the departure from that. And so to answer one part of the question, one kind of important strand of the original council's ideology was this commitment to classical reforms, kind of like normative vision of Judaism as a universalistic, justice-oriented moral worldview that derived from the writings of the Hebrew prophets, and they called it prophetic Judaism. And kind of just as important as that element is like the flip side, namely, classical reforms rejection of all those elements of traditional Judaism that can be construed as political or national or otherwise overly particularistic, separating Jews from non-Jews, preventing, kind of cordial relations and some amount of assimilation or acculturation. So, in rejecting Jewish like nationhood or nationness, the classical reform project was kind of a self-consciously modernizing project that aimed to like reconfigure Judaism as a religion in the liberal sense of a set of private commitments that, because they lack this political content, are understood as being compatible with loyalty to the nation state. It's all very like post French Revolution modernization of Judaism that has a longer tradition than the Pittsburgh Platform. So, that's one ideological strand within the council, this idea of a non-national prophetic Judaism. And, I should say that the council's project of reasserting this kind of Judaism in the face of kind of like a growing ethno-nationalism in the Jewish world was, I think in practice, it was focused a lot more on the non-national element of that formulation than on the prophetic part of the formulation. And the scholars Jeff Levin and Marjorie Feld, who's here today, I see her there. Hi, Marjorie. They both have recent books that describe how a small handful of council affiliated figures did take the idea of prophetic Judaism seriously and did attempt to apply it to the situation of, like, say, Palestinian refugees after 1948. And those are real stories and they're important touchstones to look back on. But I would say that the council itself, as an organization, tended to take the position that insofar as American Jews might wish to enact this prophetic justice-oriented morality in the American public sphere, that they should not do so as Jews. That is, they should not organize themselves within a Jewish framework in order to undertake the activism that they want to undertake. Rather, they should do so as Americans by joining, a non-sectarian civic group of some kind to join together with other non-Jews in doing that. So yeah, the council itself opposed Jewish political activism, which is a weird thing, to say or to hear about a Jewish organization, right? But I mean, it's not as strange as it might sound, given that the council's main political objective, as I understood it from all the things that I've read about it, was basically to publicly dispute the notion that Jews as a group had shared political objectives to pursue in the first place, right? And the council saw Zionism as this movement that aimed to like snuff out internal political diversity that they believed kind of naturally would prevail among Jews. And then the Zionists would then speak publicly in the name of all Jews in a way that the council believed was like inherently illegitimate and coercive even. Let me just take a quick sip. And so, the council's many political interventions, whether they were writing op-eds in the paper, or the writing letters to government officials, or in some cases having meeting with government officials, they were always geared towards undermining this semblance of Jewish political consensus on Israel and US foreign policy generally that Zionists were trying to like project. And so they were trying to counter that. And that's just to clarify it for anybody who might think otherwise. That's not to say that the council advocated what we would today call kind of like a pro-Palestinian or a human rights oriented US policy. I think it definitely did not do that, even though, kind of some figures like Elmer Berger, who was the council's original executive director and like guiding intellectual, he himself kind of moved more in the direction of like Palestinian rights. And as a result, he became, like increasingly antagonistic, like the mainstream leadership of the council. And there was a split between them eventually over these kind of issues. But, like to the extent that the council made substantive foreign policy statements, they tended to encourage the U.S. government to pursue whatever American leaders considered to be like core Cold War strategic interests, even when like pursuing those interests went against what the Israelis or the American Zionists were saying were in Israel's best interest. So they were trying to encourage that generally. And so that's all to say that, kind of like despite the fact that championing this concept of Judaism as again of a prophetic justice oriented morality was kind of central to the religious self-image of the council. The council was not an organization that like actively attempted to enact that, and its politics might be viewed today by uh, people on the progressive left as a fairly conservative politics. I don't know, I wouldn't say far right, but like kind of like liberal Cold War centrism or something like that. Which kind of brings me to like the second, the other major strand of council ideology that I want to highlight. So I was highlighting this kind of religious strand, and now I want to highlight this other strand, which is
Can
entwined with.
I can I ask you to
Go
can
ahead.
I step you back just a little
All
bit?
right, send me back. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's I think I'd love to hear just a little bit more specificity about
Mm-hmm.
this split between the kind of rabbinic leadership,
Mm-hmm.
like Berger and Lazarone and
Mm-hmm.
others of their ilk, and then who you're calling the council leadership. Um,
Right. I
I
mean, so
think that, oh yeah, I
yeah,
just
no,
wanted to say, I think that for like when most people think of Jewish institutions, just because of how they work so frequently in America. They think of the rabbis as being the leaders quite often. So how did that work in the council and how did that lead to what you're describing?
right. So I mean, a lot of the rabbis who formed the council in 1942 out of the CCAR didn't continue on very long in the council. Um, some did, but a lot of them kind of, especially after the foundation of the state of Israel, because like, I haven't looked into the exact reasons why this or that rabbi decided to leave the council. There was like one dramatic episode where a rabbi writes, a public statement condemning the council. He had been part of it. But
Was
I mean,
that Woolsey?
yes,
Yeah.
I think so. Yes, and but I think in general, it's more like rabbis, especially pulpit rabbis, are like more in touch with like the Jewish, masses, and they have to, contend with alternate perspectives that might, pressure them in a particular direction. Uh, so basically, by 1948, it's a largely lay organization. Elmer Berger, a rabbi, is still there. He's still kind of guiding the organization intellectually, but the president of the organization, the first president who was there at the beginning, also is um, oh my God, he's a Sears Roebuck heir. Why is his name? Why am I just blanking on his Rosenwald? Julius Rosenwald. Is it Julius? Yes, Julius. Or am I? I hope I'm not getting the wrong.
Lessing?
Lessing. Sorry.
Lessing.
Sorry. There's so many like different Rosenwalds. Yes, Lessing Rosenwald. Right. First president. He's not a rabbi, and he's like kind of the lay face of the organization. And yeah, after 48, basically it's a predominantly lay organization. And I have a little bit, more in what I was, going to say a little bit later about kind of like the profile as I see it. Again, I mean, I realize that right now I'm painting a kind of unflattering picture. But I do, I just want to say up front that I do see, like a lot of stuff that they were prescient about, and I will
Yeah,
I
I
do.
wouldn't call it unflattering. It's
Oh, okay,
okay. You're
okay.
fine. Yeah.
Okay, but I do have like a kind of a profile of like who were these lay members, what was their, agenda, what were their interests in being members of the council. So they, I think the rabbis bring this piece, the first strand of the ideology, the commitment to the classical reform ethical vision, whether it was applied through the council or through some other mechanism. It wasn't applied through the council, but whether they were applying it in some other way or not, they brought that was their main deal, right? And then the lay members of the council in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, I think, had a certain different set of interests that weren't necessarily the same as that, right? So I this is kind of like what I was coming to. So, the second strand of ideology, which is more representative of like the lay people, that is, I think it's like kind of crystallized in this pattern I noticed throughout council meeting minutes, publications, all sorts of council documents. You find this opposition to cultural pluralism, which is what we would today call multiculturalism. And to like put it positively rather than negatively, the council believed in the melting pot doctrine, the melting pot idea of American society. And just to clarify that, I mean, I think today when many people hear the phrase melting pot, they tend to mistake it for multiculturalism, um, which is actually the opposite of what it really means. People tend to think that to imagine America as a melting pot means just like to value diversity or something like that. But in fact, the metaphor of the melting pot is one that valorizes a monocultural ideal, right? A single synthetic culture created through the melting together of different ethno-cultural national groups, which ultimately, as individual groups, they assimilate and they lose their unique identities as groups, but they also contribute some of their own like flavor to the pot or something like that. So like everybody is enriched in some way, but nobody, there's not separate groups anymore. There's just one, unique American culture. And this melting pot view is kind of like the dominant view, the politically dominant view in the first half of the 20th century, especially kind of like the early decades where you have like, World War I. It was kind of like patriotic hysteria, and or even earlier than that, like you got presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and then Wilson. They're kind of railing against what they called kind of hyphenated Americanism, the idea of being an Irish American or German American. This was like seen as a, antithetical to patriotism, which was linked to cultural assimilation, into, what in their minds of, Wilson and Roosevelt, they wanted you to assimilate into some, like in their minds, like an Anglo, culture, right? But, for the council people, I think it was more of like the melting pot. So the Jewish culture contributes a little, je ne sais quoi, but it's still a monocultural ideal. And so, the council advocated this position, or, a version of the melting pot position. And I think, they did it exactly because Zionist thinkers at the same moment were kind of being instrumental in developing and popularizing the alternative ideal, which they call cultural pluralism, which is today, even despite Trumpism, I still think it has like a hegemony in American society. The idea that it's like okay to like have to have multiple cultures in like the fabric of the country or whatever, distinct cultures. That still is the hegemonic position. Yeah, and it was this metaphor of like I said, fabric. Cultural pluralists. It's more like, instead of a melting pot, it's more of like a patchwork quilt that combines these different units that maintain their integrity and separateness, and they're not like transformed or dissipated, but they form a beautiful tapestry or something like that. So that's like the multicultural idea that the council was, a lot of its documents that I saw show them kind of like very strongly disapproving of this idea, and they actually saw it as like what distinguished them from groups that were very similar to them otherwise, like the American Jewish Committee, which had a very similar kind of class and uh, sub-ethnic German Jewish profile. But they saw that as their disapproval of cultural pluralism was kind of like one thing that distinguished them from the AJC. Um, and they connected, their disapproval was like connected to their negative view of what they conceived as a Zionist agenda that was threatening to jeopardize their own assimilation into like a white American mainstream, which they had achieved already, right? It was threatening to kind of like disembed them from this mainstream through an undue, excessive emphasis on Jewish kind of particularity and difference, as opposed to like similarity to other Americans. And council statements would often reference the similarities, and in some cases what they saw as the direct connections between the ways that Zionists like racialized Jews, like made people think of Jews as like a foreign race. This is in the minds of these council actors. They connected that to the way that Nazis and anti-Semites racialized Jews. Like they saw these two things as being like of a piece and both bad, and therefore Zionism they thought needed to be combated because it was kind of racializing American Jews, which in the American context means kind of loss of a kind of a taken for granted whiteness, status of whiteness. And this really seemed to be kind of driving the council's opposition, not only to Zionism, but it went like a little further than that. A little like seemed it got at points, from a contemporary perspective, it got to a place that felt very unfamiliar and strange, like opposition to kind of all thicker forms of Jewish cultural expression, like the idea of that there exists a particularly like Jewish music or Jewish art is something that they at various times like expressed opposition to as a kind of, they saw it as like a slippery slope to Zionism and to racialization, to just like have that acknowledged as like a separate culture. So you know so there were these two ideological strands, the classical reform strand and the melting pot strand, which you can also call like a cultural assimilationist strand. And yes, the rabbinate, which kind of was less present in the organization after the first couple years, after the first decade, they really represented the classical reform piece, even though the organization maintained that they were dedicated to classical reform Judaism throughout. And the other piece, I think, is representative of most of the council's other lay membership. It even, so yeah, I mean, the council's membership, I would say there's like two overlapping categories. There's the first, and yeah, they might be very overlapping, but I'm going to distinguish them anyway. The first are kind of like affluent and fairly assimilated Jews who came of age in this period when hyphenated Americanism and you know what would become called cultural pluralism is constantly under attack, and who saw Zionism as like threatening their integration into the white American mainstream. So that's one type of group, and very closely tied to that, but not identical, are Jews from the American South, where the council had a very large membership. And I want to be careful to not ascribe, I want to be like charitable to whatever the motivations of the Southern members might be. So, the most charitable way, could say that for the Southern Jewish members, the council's opposition to like Jewish activism, including civil rights activism, was attractive to them because it protected them from danger in a certain way. It enabled them to disclaim the civil rights work of the mainstream national Jewish groups, uh, and to like distance themselves from it by declaring it to be unrepresentative of American Jews. Nobody can represent American Jews. There's internal diversity. Do not associate me as a Jew with what the American Jewish Congress or the ADL are saying and doing at the national level, which for them that could be dangerous. It could result in somebody bombing their synagogue or white supremacists attacking them in some other way. So that's a charitable reading and probably was representative of most of the members. And I'm sure that there is a strain that was like genuinely supportive of like segregation, and like this was most like congruent or convenient for them. But there's no like clear data to like show who was what. So yes, that's it. That's like kind of my picture uh, of the American Council for Judaism. I'm glad you didn't think, maybe now you think it's unflattering. I think just to close up there, I think it's unflattering. It seems unflattering because of how much like American society has shifted since the formative days of the council leadership, right? Like the successes of the civil rights movement and the social revolutions of the 60s, the sexual revolution, all these identity expression movements kind of legitimated cultural pluralism, and multiculturalism, as we call it, is now hegemonic. And there is also like a significant decline in like racial anti-Semitism in the post-war period, and the cultural status of American Jews as American Jews of recent European ancestry, as their status as white, I would say, has like is not like challenged so much. It maybe like on Twitter or X or whatever by like anti-Semites there, but it's largely stable in the American mind, in a way that it maybe didn't feel that way for the council members at the turn of the mid-century rather. So a lot of those anxieties are that motivated participation in the council, or the anti-Zionism of the council in the 50s and 40s and 50s, they no longer really like strike us today as being plausible. And so in short, that's kind of why I argue, and the other thing that I wrote about them, that their decline wasn't only because they were being attacked by NACRAC and like the American Jewish establishment. It was also because of this ideology was like forged in a particular moment, and like it just wasn't relatable to people going forward. And so but that doesn't mean, again, that there aren't redeeming elements that can be salvaged by the likes of you.
Um, were there any of those redeeming elements you wanted to lift up left?
Yes, sure.
Please, yeah.
Them up. Um, yeah, so I think the council made predictions about the impact that Zionism would have on American Jewish life, that contemporary non and anti-Zionist Jews today, like would perceive as having been like basically accurate, even though they probably wouldn't have phrased them in the same kind of strident way that the original council did. But like, for example, just in terms of what one of those is, council leaders often alleged in their strident way that Zionists were seeking to infiltrate. These are like kind of the terminology they use, like infiltrate and dominate every aspect of American Jewish institutional life, with the goal of purging out all dissent and transforming the American Jewish community into a kind of instrument of the state of Israel. And I think today, why I don't think somebody would phrase that in exactly the same way today. It does resonate with this kind of internal Jewish critique of the American Jewish establishment that we've seen unfurled for like 15 or more years now. And yes, what's absent is ultimately like the animating fear of dual loyalty that was driving the council's take here. That is their fear that Zionist what they called Zionist domination of American Jewish life would arouse Gentiles to greater anti-Semitism and whatnot. But so that's not here today. But that's not here probably. I would say we don't have that element because just like patriotism was took a blow from like the 1960s and 70s, like individualist, social revolutions, and people just don't feel, policed in that way anymore. But what is present today is like this general idea that the American Jewish mainstream, the establishment, conflates Zionism and Jewishness, and this is more and more prominent every day, and that this kind of conflation generates anti-Semitism. That is what I think is like the connection between. That's basically what the council was saying in a way, in their own way, in the 1950s. So that's a through line. That's like one through line where they predicted something that is still being observed. Or actually, I'm not even sure they predicted it. I mean, it was they. I was reading Marjorie and Jeff's books, about, and they touch on the council and some other figures of the time in the 50s that were kind of dissenting against what they saw as like this Zionist hegemony that was coming about. And they, even in the 50s, they referred to like the totalitarianism of like the Jewish press of the day that like wouldn't let any kind of dissenting opinion through, and like repeatedly through like it might be Jeff's book, it might be Marjorie's book, or both. You see this repetition of like totalitarianism by different anti-Zionist actors to describe, like this mood that had taken over, this pro-Zionist mood that had taken over the American Jewish like press and other institutions at that time. So maybe they weren't even like predicting it; they were just like observing it. And so, but I have like a couple more, two more things that I think that they were, essentially got right in terms of being accurate, and seeing where things were going. Another one is like their belief that ultimately there was like a basic underlying incompatibility between like the ethical universalist justice oriented conception of Judaism and the ethno-national conception of Judaism, that those two things like couldn't coexist in the same Judaism and had to be separated. And this is, like today, the contradiction is being articulated not even by anti-Zionists, but there's this viral Yom Kippur sermon. I know that you saw it, we talked about it. Maybe other people here have seen it, by the rabbi of the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in Manhattan, Ami Hirsch. And he, in this, in this sermon, he kind of very dramatically laments this trend that he sees wherein Reformed Jewish youth have begun kind of taking the idea of tikkun olam, which, I associate with like the ethical universalist justice oriented strand of Reform Judaism. So he talks about they're taking tikkun olam so seriously that they end up abandoning Zionism and Jewish peoplehood in favor of like Palestine solidarity activism. He's probably overstating things a bit, and he's obviously like not in favor of this, and he's upset and he's confused. But I think like his confusion is something that one could like easily derive from the principles articulated by the council in the 40s and 50s. So that's another thing. And like the final thing that I'd point to is, there's this generally unsuccessful effort that the council undertakes back in that period to develop and kind of disseminate its own Jewish religious educational curricula materials. And, they didn't really catch on, or at least today, you don't really see many synagogues
yet.
But I think, and we've talked about this, you and I, that a non-nationalist Jewish educational curriculum is something that today there would be more of a market for uh, than there was back then. Um, but really, I think only if the limitations of like the classical reform paradigm were kind of overcome, or like what was good in the classical reform vision was like taken and like fused with some other stuff. And I think there's like really like a thirst today among non and anti-Zionist Jews, more so than back then, for kind of a deeper engagement with Jewish tradition. When I was kind of looking through the council documents, there were some kind of striking ones that I found where the leadership is kind of lamenting the marked disinterest of many of in the membership and even in the leadership with religious Judaism, which was supposedly the raison d'etre of the organization to advocate for a non-national religious Judaism, right? But I do get the sense that today the tides have very much turned on that one, and a kind of fusion of classical reforms, kind of ethical mission with like a more thicker engagement with the
Mhm.
Jewish textual canon is kind of something that would have a really significant and wide appeal amongst like the progressive left anti-Zionists, non-Zionists of today. So that's kind of like the third through line I see, and that's yeah,
Yeah.
and that's a
Yeah.
lot.
Um, and yeah, that what you just mentioned and what you just articulated is a big part of what's driving this new renewal of the council is that exact desire. Um, and one of the threads in there that I've wondered about a lot is you mentioned the particular influence of Cold War politics on kind of the decline of the council. Um, one of the things I've wondered is if that is also related to the political shift in Israel, insofar as it was originally a like highly labor Zionist, perhaps could have been like had very strong communist threads through it through the kibbutzim. Um, but by the 60s, that was pretty much on the way out. Um, and it became a foothold of America
Yeah,
in the Middle East.
yeah,
Do you think there's a direct correlation there with the council's kind of desire? Because that's also when they kind of got rid of Elmer Berger
yeah,
finally. Do you think there's a direct correlation there with the
totally.
like American Cold War politics and Israel and all of that?
Absolutely. I mean, their argument was that uh, the close connection between the U.S. and Israel, if it stayed the way it did and did not, prioritize hard material interests that may be associated with Arab state alliances for oil and things like that, like there's going to be some like they're going to lose the Arabs like they lost China, right? Um, and then the Americans are going to like there's going to be an outburst of anti-Semitism, and they're going to blame the Jews, and
Oh,
only the I mean, this is literally what they say. One of their chief Middle East analysts says in one of their internal meeting records. He's like, the only thing that's going to stop like an outburst of anti-Semitism or a pogrom in the United States is going to be like the record of the American Council for Judaism, that they can look into it and say like, okay, these Jews have been opposing this the whole time. Have been advocating for the U.S. to just like pursue its Cold War interests without biases like of like ethnic lobby groups or whatever. And uh, I think this was undermined not because well, I mean, like the U.S. and the West did in like some ways, in the 60s, like lose, the Arab world, but it wasn't blamed on the American Jews. I mean, there was still broad American popular support for Israel. Um, and yes, there's this anxiety early on that I've mostly seen in the records of the American Jewish Committee, which is like the group that I said
mhm.
that the council is most closely associated with. But you can look at their like meeting minutes for the early 1950s, after Israel is kind of like they're trying to grapple with like the implications of the state of Israel for their advocacy, and like what should we support military aid? Should we lobby the state for military aid to the government of Israel? Is like the question that they're just debating, and because they're like kind of have a familial relationship to like a genetic relationship to the council. There's like a lot of people still within the American Jewish Committee who are like, no, we should not support any kind of Jewish politics, nation state, military power, things like that. We should only support charitable projects to like resettle immigrants, philanthropy. We should do philanthropy. We
Sure.
should not do political advocacy, lobbying the state, the Congress for military aid. And it comes back at them from other members that, uh, well, we have to do this because, first of all, like money is fungible, right? So if you give them money for philanthropy, it's really just supporting the state. So there's no real distinction there. But also because like if Israel is destroyed, this will be like a massive like undermining of American Jewish self-confidence, and it could lead to an explosion of anti-Semitism in the United States. And because we want to maintain the real reason is like we want to maintain uh, influence with the Israeli government so as to push them in the democratic, non-socialist, capitalist direction in the Cold War. We want to have leverage with them because it's really going to be bad for American Jews if they go communists, if Mapam, which is the Soviet-oriented leftist party that Ben Gurion sidelined in his first government and didn't bring in, but they had the second largest Knesset showing in the first election, right? So Mapam, the Soviet pro-Soviet party, is very popular in Israel, at least at the beginning of the state, right? What if, and they're actively contemplating, what if they win? If they win, then there's just going to be, outbreak of anti-Semitic violence in the United States against Jews. So we have to we can't just leave things to chance. We have to support the state so that we can push them in a democratic direction. And they're all thinking about it in terms of the ramifications for like American Jews and their safety and security, right? So Israel is creating this problem as they see it in the midst, and it only makes sense in the midst of the Cold War. Their discussion really only makes sense if you take the Cold War into it. And then, over time, yes,
And I
Israel
also,
moves, into the pro-Western camp, and then it's not
yeah,
an issue anymore. When Israel's like firmly in the pro-Western camp, and it's clear that Americans and the American policymakers don't care about the Arab world as much as they thought they did, right? Then the whole council fear is just like pulled out from under, like, look, you
yeah,
were wrong. And that was their whole thing.
yeah. I think also just on top of that, what's resonating in my mind as you're talking about the kind of like communist fears of Israel's influencing America is the fact that during the Red Scare, Jews were targeted as like communists writ large,
Right.
right?
That's in
So
the
they,
background. That's in the
yeah, so
background. Yeah.
they had already experienced, they were experiencing
Yes.
that directly already. Um,
Yeah, that's the
and
link. That's why they thought, Jews would be
yeah,
targeted, because it would be like, okay, now there's a Jewish state and it's a communist state. So, we were
right.
right in our suspicion that all Jews are communists, etc.
Right, exactly. And then I also wonder if that relates to a certain degree to what you were talking about in the South, because the way, and this could be a misunderstanding of history, I'm not a historian, um, but I do think that there was in the minds of a lot of people in America a linkage between the Red Scare, communism, and civil rights,
Of
right?
course. Yeah, they
Yeah,
were communist regime. I mean, like, an explanation for why, civil rights movement was happening from the side of the people who didn't want it to be happening, was that it was like communists infiltrating and causing trouble.
right.
And
Yeah,
that gave a sanction to like, violently crack down on them.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So thank you for that, because that's a piece of this era. I feel like the late 60s, when we talk about Zionism and its relationship, into America, and how after the Six-Day War, everything changed. Um, the narrative that I always hear is really that it's all about the Six-Day War, right? But I think that Red Scare background is probably even more influential than the Six-Day War was itself. And the Six-Day War was related, right? It was
Mhm.
related to the Cold War very, very heavily. Um, so I
Yeah.
think that that's a piece that often is missing in this conversation.
Yeah, and kind of like the piece that I was trying to bring with my dissertation, which it still hasn't been turned into a book for various reasons, and maybe one day it will be. But um, the piece that I was trying to bring into it was that one reason for the turn after 67 was also that like a large nationwide like infrastructure of communication between different advocacy groups like the JCRCs, the Jewish Community Relations Councils, the national groups and all their chapters, that was kind of forged in like the 2 decades prior to the 67 war and was kind of complete and functioning by the first war that it was like completely functioning for was the 67 war, and that allowed just like a lot of uh transfer of information to generate advocacy. It resulted in a huge explosion of advocacy for Israel that is usually portrayed as like a spontaneous emotional reaction,
Yes,
and
yes,
that
yes,
is what
yes.
I was skeptical of that because you can read stuff about the American Jewish response to like the 1948 war, and polls and accounts of that time show that also like American Jews were very like supportive of the creation of Israel. Like the masses were very supportive of this. They had a very strong emotional reaction then, but they didn't have this like mass mobilization the same way that there was in 1967 was like a very huge moment, and it was a moment where the Jewish federations and other organizations realized that well they believed that Israel was so emotionally compelling to the American Jewish public that that is how they should orient their programming in the future so as to bring in more people and get more interest and ultimately fund their organizations, would be to like kind of center Israel. They saw 1967 and they said, okay, this big reaction was there, but I'm kind of saying like like emotionally Jews actually were in the same or a similar, not the same, but a similar place in 1947 to 48. There was a war. It could have gone very badly for the Yishuv, right? Um,
Mhm.
the Jewish, the Zionists, the Israeli state, won the war. There was a big triumph, and it did have an emotional resonance, but there wasn't this massive like activism and coordinated response. And so I'm arguing that this infrastructure that was built mostly by the philanthropic federations and their public relations agencies uh, was like the
Like
cause of that.
created that basically.
Created, yeah, the conditions where that could happen.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Because when I have conversations with people, of an age that were, uh, like conscious in 67, right? Like that they were like, they weren't necessarily adults, but they were like old enough to like be aware of what was going on. There is a very uniform, and I mean of people that were like deeply involved in Jewish life and Jewish institutional life. There's a very uniform reaction and response. Um, and even today, when we have conversations about Zionism and its importance, especially with liberal Zionists today, folks that were alive and aware at all in 67 point to 67 as to why. Say that, like, I was alive when I saw that the state was almost wiped out and we were all terrified and there was this media blackout and yada, 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 right? And then it was a miracle. Like the word
Mhm.
miracle gets used a lot.
And I'm not saying that's inorganic. I'm saying that like nothing is organic in the world.
Yeah.
Like one's reaction to something is based entirely on like how much information and what type of information one is getting about it, and how much information and what type of information one gets is determined by the institutions that exist to show you things.
Right. And the thing that always gets me about that talking point is that if you like, because these documents are declassified now, if you read documentation from like international intelligence agencies, they all knew that Israel was going to just have no problem. They thought that
What did
what happened was
LBJ?
what was going to
LBJ
happen.
said to the Israelis who came to talk to him about their desire to preemptively attack. He said, we don't think you should do it, but if you do, you'll whip them. That's what
Yeah.
LBJ said. And so, yeah, it was well known.
Yeah.
But that narrative obviously was not the one that was like transmitted. The narrative
That
of
yeah.
Second Holocaust is one that was transmitted and probably genuinely felt by millions of
Sure.
people. Yeah.
Yeah.
But of course,
Um,
yeah, the partial narrative. But history unearthed those correspondences that you just, and that takes decades. So,
right, of course. But you do wonder when those who have the power to choose which narrative they're going to put forward, choose which one they put forward, how much information did they have? Because we also know, like with the actual Holocaust, that there were a lot of people that knew and just were choosing not to say anything about it for a very long time. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's a live question to me. Um,
but yeah, I think it
where,
speaks
yeah,
to like this question of, building the institutions that are necessary for like an alternative Jewish experience in the United States. Um, obviously the constituency for that is it's growing, but it's still pretty small. But it contends with like an apparatus that is, I do also like show how this apparatus is not as centralized as it was in the past, and there's all kinds of kind of like vigilante billionaires, your Sheldon Adelsons and other people like him that are like
yeah,
investing
Kraft is
in their
doing like
own.
lots of, yeah,
Yeah, they're doing kind of like a lot of astroturf organizations, and but I mean, you can turn astroturf into real turf with enough money,
yeah,
um, and so but what is needed, I think, like Jewish Currents, for instance, is like a great uh, starting point. They're rebooting of Jewish Currents in terms of like having a media apparatus that can convey an alternative reality. Um, and that I think needs to institution building needs to happen in a sustainable way if the people that you are trying to represent are to have a chance at sustainable institutionalization.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
Do
that is what we're working on, and many others are as well.
you have any billionaires
Um,
that are going to donate to you?
um, if you know any, let me know.
Give no, Sheldon.
Yeah, give,
I'll
give
give
me, yeah,
Miriam a call.
yeah. We'll have to, yeah. Maybe Sheldon might be easier to talk to than Miriam at this point,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
uh, um, awesome. Well, thank you for all that. I wanna look at the Zoom chat and see if anyone's got any questions. I'm gonna invite any of you who might have questions that are here on Zoom. You can put them in the chat. I think that if you go to the React button and hit raise hand, something should pop up for me, and I can unmute you. We have a small enough group here that I know who most of you are, so I feel pretty comfortable unmuting you. Um, uh, Seth, in particular, I'd love to hear what you mean by the so-called Zionism of the left. Um, the I'm not sure if you're talking about liberal Zionism or something completely different. If you'd be comfortable, if you want to come off mute, I'd love to hear what you mean.
Yeah, hi, Matt. I was thinking more in terms of some of the things that Matt was saying about anti-Zionism being perceived as anti-Semitism. And we hear from the Trump folks that anti-Semitism on the left is really the big evil, when it's really anti-Zionism, at least as I understand it.
And what part of what I said were you trying to connect to that, just so I can like make the connection? Is he there? You're muted if you're talking.
Oh, did he remute? I may just let people unmute.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly when I posted that, but it was when you were talking about the relationship between the Jewish community being afraid of dual loyalty.
Mm, hmm, hmm. Well, I'm, so yeah, I mean, obviously today, we're seeing, an extremely frightening use of state power. I mean, with Mahmoud Khalil, I'm sure that we're aware of this guy is maybe not, maybe we're not aware of it, but there's this student pro-Palestinian organizer at Columbia who was kidnapped by ICE, the immigration agency. He's a green card holder, permanent resident, and there's apparently some sort of secret evidence that I've read dozens of articles. Nobody has presented any evidence that he is. There's supposedly, like, the Trump administration has some secret evidence that he is connected to uh, terrorist activity or Hamas in such a way that his speech, that his activity on Columbia's campus constitutes a national security threat to the United States, right? So I think, like today, it's mostly, pro-Palestinian organizers, and especially immigrants, those from the Arab and Muslim world, that are uh, in fear of being stigmatized as like enemies of the state, right? As part of this, joint uh, Trump administration, Christian Zionist, and some right wing Jewish groups. Because I was happy to see that a lot of mainstream Jewish groups, but not the Anti Defamation League, condemned what is happening to this young man who, I mean, if I haven't made it clear enough, he's kind of like been disappeared, and there's allegedly some like documents that prove something about him, and they try to deport him, but it's kind of a revival of the new Cold War framework that emerged, metaphorizing this, but the new Cold War that emerged after 9/11, the war on terror, right? They're reviving like kind of war on terror. So now the framework is the war on terror, and this is being instrumentalized today. And I don't think, you know, Jews are any longer in this position of being suspected of being enemies of the state. Now it's kind of shifted over to Arabs, Muslims. Although obviously, if Jews on the left join, in the pro-Palestinian solidarity movement, there's nothing to say that they won't be treated in the same way if they happen to be immigrants, or maybe it will go beyond immigrants. We don't know. It's actually a really frightening moment right now where the Trump administration is testing out these new, very unconstitutional, coercive measures to deal with anybody who they see as they can plausibly, in the minds of some critical mass of American elites, frame as being pro-Hamas. And that, we've seen, if you follow the discourse, that designation is applied to so many different, like in the last since 10/7, the pro-Hamas designation, I mean, it was applied to me, and I have not, honestly, like, maybe to my discredit or my shame, I haven't really been involved in any activism at all in the last 2 years, and yet I was declared in various journalistic articles that were written like a professor of Hamas on Oberlin's campus, right? And so, like, can any kind of framing of you as pro-Hamas be a justification for like the egregious violation of your rights? It does seem like that we are heading in that direction, but maybe I've gotten off topic.
I don't think you've gotten off topic because I think it is about it's a different level of dual loyalty, right? Like it's not the dual loyalty that is being accused is of progressives, including progressive Jews, of being loyal to Hamas, right? As opposed to being loyal to the state of America.
Yeah.
or increasingly the conflation of the state of America and the state of Israel, which the Trump administration loves to do. And what you're describing is laid out as a tactic very explicitly in this Project Esther document that the Heritage Foundation wrote in the wake of October 7th as a way to create the kind of cultural and political circumstances in which calling someone pro-Hamas would be a way of doing exactly what's happening. Like this, there was a playbook written in there using it. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
I'm
yeah,
really like curious to see what type of legal argument that, because right, this is the treatment of Khalil right now is based on like an order issued by Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, where he avows that like there's some good evidence to show that this guy is a national security threat. So I'm
right.
like really interested to see how this like plays out in the court and whether it's like rebuffed or like whatever like artificial evidence they use to like prove this claim is accepted and what those arguments are going to be. It's like a really like uncertain and crucial moment, I think, in the history of the country.
Yeah, and I think, as you said before, in the history of kind of Jewish institutional um, unity, right? Like it's not falling all in the same way this time.
Yeah.
The ADL is falling that way, ZOA is the like very declared politically right organizations are, but even the moderates are like this is not good. Um,
Yeah, I saw Zionists,
yeah,
which I don't know to what extent we should consider Zionists to be a astroturf or a grassroots project, but it is definitely a right wing, organization, kind of masquerading itself as a progressive organization. But actually, I was surprised when they came out against this. I mean, they framed it in all sorts of ways that I, found tendentious, but they did ultimately come out against it, and I think that's surprising. And but the
yeah.
ADL, I don't know. I know I shouldn't be surprised by the ADL, but
It's
I
hard with this
it
kind of
made
stuff.
its
It's
bona
yeah,
fides on like all this civil rights stuff, and this is just so egregious, and I can't believe that they have sunk in so low, honestly.
yeah, yeah. The other piece that I think like to a certain degree, this could be another way in which the early council was prescient about things, is this idea that you can create this like unified Jewish political voice. It's held for a while, but it's not holding right now. And one of the greatest signs of it is that the biggest independent actor that is Jewish in this entire debacle was the judge that stayed Khalil's deportation was a Jewish guy,
Mm.
a progressive judge, and
I
he and
do
his
think that sorry if you have more to say.
not really.
I mean, I do think that there's more and more signs of kind of like the breakdown of I mean, it's been happening for a really long time, since the 80s. I think we've seen like the fragmentation, decentralization of the American Jewish political world from what it was established, in the decades leading up to 1970, 67, and then maintained for a couple more decades. And then it's been like fragmenting with all these billionaires coming in and like doing their own thing and not putting their money into like the centralized organization of the federation system. But like in recent years, I find it interesting to look at like for instance, I recall like some kind of testimony that was being given by ADL and a bunch of other Jewish individuals, organizations, uh, for and against the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which I think this is back in 2016 or so, and it was like a piece of legislation that was supposed to get the education department, the barely existing now education department, to utilize the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which includes, anti-Zionism among its examples, right? So it was trying to get that, and uh, Jonathan Greenblatt or some ADL representative, like was really trying more than he ever had to before in the documents that I've seen, over the years to like project the ADL as like representative of something called the American Jewish community. Like he had to like strain to do this in the face of like other groups and individuals who were saying that this is who are testifying against the legislation that he was supporting, right? And that strikes me as like a significant shift where it's like no longer can you just by default be assumed that one of these major organizations is like speaking in like some voice that could be credited for the entire community. They're now there's like some struggle over that, even by the ADL. And yeah, it seems like they're digging themselves more and more into a hole now with this
Yeah.
latest move. So you want to ask one of these other people over there?
Yes, let's ask.
Bruce?
We'll do Ethan and then we'll go to Bruce. Thank you for your hand, Bruce. Um, Ethan asked, how did the ultimate dominance of Jewish institutional Zionism work its way into the Jewish education of new generations of Jews during and after the 60s?
Hmm. Well, I mean, there's a lot of like elements of Jewish education that I certainly like cannot have not done like the deep research into speaking to speak to, like whatever textbooks and synagogue-based education, which is like a lot of it that I certainly can't speak to at all. And that's a a book that maybe I don't believe anybody's written that one, but it should be written. It would take a lot of research, but what I do know is like that I study the kind of the federation system, and they are instrumental in funding a bunch of different educational projects, right? And you can see one thing that I trace is, and I mentioned this a little bit before, but after the outpouring of activism and sentiment that was kind of channeled through these new networks that were built right before 1967, after that happens in 67, a lot of the federations, the broader federation system kind of says, okay, Israel is what the kids like. There's a couple things like nobody's into the other stuff that we do. Like obviously, federations were very much instrumental in like social services in the first half of the 20th century for immigrant communities, like building hospitals and kind of integrating immigrants into the American mainstream and things like that through educational apparatuses. But none of that old stuff was interesting, and they were kind of like losing the youth. There were no like kind of young people coming up to like be federation donors and executives. And so, but then after 1967, they're like, okay, Israel is the thing, and also Soviet Jewry is very important. These are like the two, kind of hooks that we have to get the youth. And so that led them to expand massively their investment in like kind of Israel committees for the Hillels that they were funding. Like Hillels, weren't so overly concerned with, educating around and doing activism for Israel before that moment. And then there was like kind of a massive investment over the next like couple decades in Hillels. So that's like an educative mechanism that I have studied a bit. And then of course, like as there's like not it's not only there's another element to consider when it comes to Israel education, because it's also conceived by the federation system that I've studied as a kind of mechanism for sustaining Jewish identity in general, not only like participation in their own programs, but in the 90s in particular, but even starting earlier, there's this kind of continuity crisis, this idea that American Jews are intermarrying and their children are not embracing Jewish identity, and there's going to be fewer and fewer Jews over time. And so they embrace kind of Israel experience trips, as they call them. Like Birthright becomes the ultimate example of this. But going to Israel, learning about Israel becomes a way of heightening, like getting an instant boost in a number of metrics. And they do many studies of like the effects of birthright on intermarriage and whether you raise your kid Jewish. And they all seem to find that there is like a measurable effect of these programs. And so kind of Israel is seen as a way of kind of, I think one kind of writer and commentary said that 1967 war was like instant Zionism, well, it's like birthright in Israel is like instant Judaism. You can send somebody on a birthright trip and then pull them afterwards, and they'll be like X likely more to be engaged with their Jewish community, to be considering marrying another Jew. So Israel educational mechanisms become a mechanism for reproducing the Jewish community writ large. And I think that's why it becomes so deeply embedded, because that's I think fighting anti-Semitism and fighting assimilation are the main concerns of like a mainstream American Jewish organizations. But Israel like falls into that as an instrumental mechanism for achieving those goals in various ways that I've talked about already in terms of the anti-Semitism piece, right? So yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
Great. Great. Thank you. Bruce, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, this sort of ties in a little bit with what you've just been saying, but this sounds like it's about an ethnic identity and an ethnic lobby. Where does the religious tradition, as indicated with your notion of prophetic, we were talking about at the very beginning, prophetic morality, how does that or doesn't fit into what's happening now? Is my question clear? I'm not sure it is.
Well, I mean, maybe Andy wants to talk to this as being more of the person that is trying to reclaim aspects of classical Reform Judaism. I would just point back to the Amiel Hirsch anecdote that I told earlier, where we see this very high profile Reform rabbi who obviously their synagogue, if you go to their website, it's very clear that they see themselves as being like very justice oriented and very much in the vein of this like prophetic Judaism, but now are becoming saddened and confused by the fact that there's a clash between the commitment to Zionism and the commitment to prophetic Judaism. And I believe that his conclusion was that he would reform his Tikkun Olam curriculum to be less Tikkun Olami and more Klal Israel, more Jewish peoplehoody. But yeah, Andy, tell me what you think.
Yeah. Bruce, can you clarify when you say what's happening now? Which part of what's happening now are you referring to?
Well, I'm not exactly sure either. But if the ACJ begins with this tension between prophetic Judaism and the rejection of multiculturalism, because you can't really have both at the same time, it seems. I wonder how that tension is played out over time and what currently ACJ is sort of how it's thinking through that tension.
That's a great question. Yeah. Um, so I don't think those two things are actually in tension inherently. The multiculturalism and prophetic Judaism, I don't think they're inherently in tension. And in fact, um, I think that to a certain degree, even if you go back and read Elmer Berger's writing, Elmer Berger was one of the founding rabbis, was the executive director for a very long time. Then when they got a new executive director, he was the executive vice president, still had a very strong leadership role up until 1967, when what Matt was talking about before happened, that he spoke out of turn, one might say, about what happened in the 1967 war, and it led to conflict with some of the lay leadership of the ACJ, and he chose to leave. So you can see that even he's a little bit uncomfortable with it. This focus on being like this focus on prophetic Judaism and a focus on the full melting pot. Because the thing, like Matt was saying before, I think you articulated this really well, is that there was still this desire for Judaism to color and shade whatever everything was melting into, right? That like the prophetic Judaism, the ethical monotheism of the early reformers was supposed to be a key ingredient of what this American melting pot was would maintain, right? Like other things may fall away, like the ethnic ethnocultural aspects of Ashkenazi Judaism that many of the German Jews that had come to America early found to be in some ways embarrassing when their Eastern European Jewish neighbors maintain some of these practices from the old country. Like that's what they wanted to melt away. But they thought actually to a certain degree, and this it wasn't new for them, right? Felix Adler, who established the ethical culture movement, was the son of Rabbi Samuel Adler, who was a classical reformer, who did and what Felix did was what like was kind of the ultimate idea of the melting pot. He was like, well, if we're going to be about ethical monotheism, why don't we just kind of get rid of the monotheism and just say like we're going to do the ethics, and tried to completely kind of de-Judaize this idea. And ethical culture is still around, but so is Judaism. And what I was thinking when Matt was talking about kind of the difference in the approach of what we're doing today is that like if they were trying to make a broth, right? Like everything was like melted together into one substance. The goal is more like a stew. You know, like a good stew, you got chunks of a lot of different things, and everything's got the same kind of flavor profile. But you don't want to get rid of the potatoes. You don't want the potatoes to totally melt. You don't want the beef to totally melt. You don't want, or we could even say cholent if we wanted to go Eastern European Ashkenazi. Like you got to keep some of the true aspects that are diverse for the ultimate outcome to be compelling and to be beautiful and to be um I hate the word authentic because it means nothing, but to be authentic. And so the different approach we're taking today is that one of the key the key guiding values are those of ethical monotheism, right? Are those of this prophetic um, universalist viewpoint as to Judaism's relationship with the world, right? In the covenant that God makes with Abraham in Genesis, the same covenant actually the Zionists love to quote, where God promises this land to Abraham and his offspring. And often when this is quoted, it is forgotten that one of his offspring was Ishmael, right? So and it didn't specify Isaac; it said your offspring. But that's an aside. It goes on to say, and your descendants will be as multitudinous as the stars of the sky, and they will be a blessing to all of the peoples of the earth, right? So it's already presaging this idea that Jews are going to be everywhere, that the descendants of Abraham are going to be everywhere, not just Jews, and going to bring a blessing to all the people of the earth. And the prophetic tradition says that blessing is this ethical viewpoint, is this idea that the covenant with God is about how we engage in the world with an eye towards ethics, with making sure that at the time of the prophets, the like the triad was the widow, the orphan, and the stranger needed to be protected at all costs because they were the people that were most oppressed. And that shifts depending upon your cultural context. But that was the core element of what God was saying through the prophets is like, I don't care if you make sacrifices, I don't care what you do, other than these, like, none of it matters unless you are upholding these ethical tenets. And so that is a core guiding element. Um, but that has been expressed in immeasurable, innumerable ways, no matter where Jews have been all over the world. And the thing that is really important to me is making sure that all of those different ways that kind of ethical approach and understanding of the Jewish relationship to the world, they're all lifted up. Not that one form of it is the ultimate form of it, but that as long as it is in line with those ethical tenets, we want to lift up those different forms of Judaism because they're all beautiful, and there is no one Judaism that can speak for all people. This is one of the core things that I think is really important from the early ACJ, is this idea of a necessary uniformity, really goes against all of Jewish history. Um, Got another question from Craig. Yeah, Matt, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a rabbi, you're the rabbi, but so I can't speak to really scriptural matters, but like I think it's not necessarily that there's a contradiction or even a deep tension between like cultural pluralism and prophetic Judaism. It's more like the state worship that ethno-national conception of Judaism has like become, uh,
Mhm.
where the people of Israel is conflated with the state of Israel, and this kind of like kind of ignores or something the fact that and you tell me if I'm wrong about this, but my understanding of the prophets is that they were critics of Israel. They were critics of the state, the state, the Jewish states that they were engaged with at different points in time, and they were critics of the people of Israel, but more so the leaders, right? The states, the kings.
A little bit of
No,
both, a lot of both. Yeah,
both, yeah. I
yeah.
mean, yeah, it was they were, you're right. So they were like kind of rebuking Israel, the people, and the Jewish states, when they believed that they had gone out of line. And this is like a major part of Jewish tradition that like I'm just like amazed that it's not taken into consideration in these debates that we have about like how much to criticize Israel or not. I mean, like, isn't that like a fundamental part of it? That it's
How
like
dare you?
the
How dare you say you could
institutionalized
be a
criticism
prophet?
by canonizing these prophets. They
Yeah,
institutionalize this very harsh self-criticism. So I think that's very, very Jewish, but that's just
yeah.
me.
No, I agree. Um, our last question is from Craig. Craig Karnick is asking, is the goal to separate anti-Zionism from anti-Israel doomed? Is there something we can do to rescue the concept, or do the evangelicals and the old men running the traditional Jewish organizations? I don't know where that question ended, but I think I know the gist of what you're asking. Um, I think that one person to read that helps answer this question very clearly is Shalom Magid. I would also say Peter Beinart's newest book is very much an answer to this question, which is like, what's the difference between being anti-Zionist and being anti-Israel? And the early ACJ, in fact, got accused consistently, not just the early, like when I mean early, I mean before now. ACJ got accused consistently of being anti-Israel. And their response was like, we're not anti-Israel. We're anti-ethno-nationalism. We are pro-democracy. And the way that Israel was going to be established and then was established, and they said this from the very beginning, was anti-democratic. There were already people living there, and they were not going to get equal rights because they weren't Jews, because this was going to be a Jewish state. And so the way today, in my mind, to be anti-Zionist without necessarily being anti-Israel is to say the Zionism of Israel is the thing that makes it an ethno-state, is the way in which um, the Jewishness of an individual is what is used as the litmus for whether they have full rights or not. And getting rid of that is not necessarily anti-Israel. People say that it is for various reasons I'm not going to go into, but I think that is the way that most people are separating it today, and I don't think it's doomed at all. I think it's actually on the uptick, if anything.
Yeah, I
You wanna
mean,
add anything, Matt?
all I would add is that, like, I don't know how I assume that the new ACJ, tell me if I'm wrong, you guys are embracing the anti-Zionist label. Is that what you're doing?
We're trying to figure out how, because it's such a nebulous term that
Exactly.
can mean so many things that we're trying to figure out how to do it in a way won't that will be understandable.
Yeah, I know there's like very strong opinions on like whether you should identify as an anti-Zionist or a
Right.
non-Zionist or whatever. And I mean, I'm like a social democrat, or and I'm a civil libertarian or whatever. And like those are my core commitments. And I don't really like to define myself against particular ethnic nationalisms. Going like I'm against Kurdish ethno-nationalism. It's bad if it's like oppressive, and I'm against Jewish. I don't like to do that. I just like to have a set of values. It could be it can take an anti form, but it would have to be like a broader anti ethno-nationalism or whatnot. And I think, yeah, you just get dragged into like so many arcane debates that like do not matter at all when you start to use certain terminology. But I understand that some people think it's important to do that as a form of kind of like Palestine solidarity or something. But
Right.
I personally feel that it's more trouble than it's worth, and it's better to define your values ultimately positively than negatively.
Mhm.
That's just my view.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. We went a couple minutes over, but 2 minutes ain't bad in my book. Um, Thank you, Professor Berkman, so much for your time, for your willingness to be a part of this, for especially as our sort of test subject. But I think everything went well. Your work and your research has been invaluable to me to understanding the history of this organization. And it has been invaluable, at least from what I can tell, to tons and tons of students that you've taught and given some uh, amazing historical context and wisdom to help them navigate these crazy times. So thank you for all you do. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. I'd like to see your data on that last piece. But yes, thank you. I really appreciate what you're trying to do with this to like kind of rejuvenate it in a new spirit, that puts aside what was not useful in the past and takes what is useful and good and tries to bring it forward. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to put a Google form in the chat. Everyone that registers is going to get in an email too. Just a little bit of feedback would be really helpful. And also in the chat, I'm going to put a link to our PayPal donate page. Please do, if you have the means, consider donating further to this cause. We are working very hard to make this renewal of the ACJ successful, and every dollar counts. So thank you so much. All of you folks who have registered will be getting a follow-up email as well. And again, Matt, thank you so much for being with us.
Bye.
Bye.